Hello there, men, and welcome to the Masculinism Movement channel, a place for men to be men and talk about masculinity and men's issues. I'm your host, Brian Krall, and today I'm bringing you a special video. It's going to be very different from what I normally do. This is a video on penis poetry. So I picked out two masculine poems about the penis, which I think really represent masculinity and the cause of masculinism as well, and would be very appropriate for this channel. So what I have here is two poems, one from me, actually a poem that I wrote, and one from my favorite poet of all time, Jim Morrison of The Doors fame, the musical band from the 60s and 70s, which if you haven't heard them or even much of their music, if you've only heard their radio songs, I highly recommend perusing their albums because they are, I think, one of the best and most influential American bands of all time. And Jim Morrison is my favorite poet. He was more than just a musician and lyricist, but a poet as well, and a very spiritual person. So his poetry is extremely deep and spiritual. And I've picked out one of my top three poems of his, which is one of my top three poems of all time. So I'm going to read that one to you first, and then break it down for you afterwards. And it is called Lament for the Death of My Cock. Lament for my cock, sore and crucified. I seek to know you, acquiring soulful wisdom. You can open walls of mystery, strip show. How to acquire death on the morning show. TV death which the child absorbs. Death well mystery which makes me right. Slow train the death of my cock gives life. Forgive the poor old people who gave us entry, taught us God in the child's prayer in the night. Guitar player, ancient wise satyr, sing your ode to my cock. Caress its lament, stiffen and guide us, we frozen. Lost cells, the knowledge of cancer, to speak to the heart and give the great gift. Words. Power, trance. This stable friend and the beasts of his zoo, wild-haired chicks, women flowery in their summit, monsters of skin, each color connects to create the boat which rocks the race. Could any hell be more horrible than now and real? I pressed her thigh, and death smiled. Death, old friend, death and my cock are the world. I can forgive my injuries in the name of wisdom, luxury, romance. Sentence upon sentence, words are healing lament for the death of my cock's spirit has no meaning in the soft fire. Words got me the wound and will get me well, if you believe it. All join now and lament for the death of my cock, a tongue of knowledge on the feathered night. Boys get crazy in the head and suffer. I sacrifice my cock on the altar of silence. Alright, so that is a very powerful piece, obviously. I hope that you can see why it is one of my favorite poems of all time and a very good message for this channel, which I am now going to analyze and break down with my own commentary. Now, the first thing that I want to address here is the elephant in the room that I'm sure is on everyone's mind, and that is, why is Jim saying the word cock instead of some other word? Because obviously cock is slang. You know, he could be saying something more eloquent or more spiritually symbolic and meaningful like phallus. So why choose the word cock instead? Well, for starters, this was written in the 60s or 70s when American culture had basically won a big battle against censorship. You see, swearing and using slang words and sexual language and such used to be illegal in public. And so people couldn't even say it on their own TV shows. It wasn't allowed on TV networks. And musicians like Jim Morrison couldn't even say it in their own concerts oftentimes. If they were held in a, like a public arena, they weren't allowed to say certain swear words. So there were certain people like Jim Morrison who fought the battle against censorship and, you know, got some big wins in the ability to do things like swearing in public or swearing in their concerts. So they started exercising those rights. Jim Morrison started screaming the word fuck at his concerts. So vulgar language is something that made an emergence into the artwork, the lyrical and poetic artwork of the hippies of the 60s and 70s, because they saw it as a free speech issue, and that art and music and poetry need to be able to be vulgar at times in order to not only express yourself, but, you know, express a variety of things. Art needs to be able to be dark at times. Art needs to be able to be sexual at times. Art needs to be able to express pain or anger or any sort of vulgarity that it needs to. And so I think that Jim chooses the word cock over penis or phallus or any other word because he's trying to be a bit vulgar here, because that is where he is at in his mind when he's writing this. So yeah, he intentionally chose to use the word cock instead of a very elegant word like phallus, because this poem isn't about portraying his cock as a phallus, as my poem after it is going to be, but it's about portraying the more vulgar and even dirty side of sexuality, and Jim tells it like it is and won't censor himself. So moving on, let's go over this poem and talk about what it all means exactly. It starts out saying, "Lament for my cock, sore and crucified." So I assume that his cock is sore and kind of dead because of too much sex. And potentially STDs too. I mean, with the way that he was living, you might actually think that. And yet, he feels as though he has only begun to get to know himself sexually through sex, and still has yet to do so on a deep personal level. For he goes on to say, "I seek to know you, acquiring soulful wisdom. You can open walls of mystery, strip show." So he obviously wishes to get to know his sexual nature more, and that having sex has certainly been a gateway to that sort of hidden knowledge, the forbidden fruit of sexual carnal knowledge. And he is now realizing that there is hidden wisdom in his penis that will be revealed when layers of himself are stripped away or something, perhaps. I don't know. But then he goes on to talk about some of the appearances the concept of death makes in everyday life for him, such as how to acquire death in the morning show. It's an interesting concept. TV death, which the child absorbs. Death well mystery, which makes me right. Slow train, the death of my cock gives life. Then he says, "Forgive the poor old people who gave us entry, taught us God in the child's prayer in the night." So here, I believe he is saying that the media and all that social conditioning and cultural programming is not good for us and is basically killing our brains. But that death is also, in a sense, a sort of inspiration to him, as the great mystery of life is what makes him right. His mortality, the existential angst, of the existential conundrum of life and death, and that it is in using his penis until it dies and, is done, that it can create new life. That we are here on earth basically to reproduce and then go ahead and die. So sex is a sort of slow train to death, a ride we take that can make life less painful and death less painful, since living is dying, and can give new life. And Jim says we should forgive our elders who went through this cycle to make us and then brainwashed us with their religion and media and taught us their prayers in the night because they didn't know any better. But you know who does know better? Musicians and poets like Jim Morrison. So he goes on to say, "Guitar player, ancient wise satyr, sing your ode to my cock. Caress its lament, stiffen and guide us, we frozen. Lost cells, the knowledge of cancer, to speak to the heart and give the great gift. Words, power, trance." So here, since we cannot depend on our parents to develop us properly, we must call upon ancient archetypes such as the wise satyr and artisan poets. We must turn to the meaningful messages in our mythos of our songs and literature. It is through the arts that we create the romanticism that makes life bearable and can bring us love, and it distracts us from the dark truths out there that we are just a bundle of lost cells decaying until you die, perhaps by cancer. So we seek out words So we speak out words that speak to our hearts and inspire us and bring us joy, for words have the power to put us into an emotional trance. And then Jim goes on to say, "This stable friend and the beasts of the zoo, wild-haired chicks, women flowering in their summit, monsters of skin, each color connects to create the boat which rocks the race. Could any hell be more horrible than now and real?" It seems that Jim, being a celebrity hippie, is speaking of times he would have great Romanesque orgies with women of many races. And while he found some sort of love in this great spiritual experience that was, of course, very idyllic and blissful, he realized that this heaven was actually just a hell in disguise. So much pleasure. And what was it covering up? Death. And yet, in those moments of hell on earth, you have to ask yourself, is this really real? Is anything real? Then Mr. Morrison says, one of my favorite lines, I pressed her thigh, and death smiled. So this is perhaps my favorite line of the poem, or one of two. So Jim is touching a girl's thigh, nearing her vagina in the start of sex. And then either death, like the Grim Reaper, smiles because sex, in a sense, leads to death, right? Fulfilling your biological imperative means you can then go ahead and die, right? Or you could even take this line to mean the realization that death is in the girl that Jim is touching. That when she feels sexually aroused by touch, she smiles down at him and he sees death in her eyes. A very scary thought, but perhaps when we give our penis to a woman, we are really giving our life force over to her and just bringing ourselves closer to death. It's something to think about. So let me repeat that line now along with the next stanza as I move on. I pressed her thigh and death smiled. Death, old friend, death and my cock are the world. I can forgive my injuries in the name of wisdom, luxury, romance. So Jim has obviously made peace with the idea of death, the idea he's going to die, and for a while now, because he calls death an old friend. Perhaps he even welcomes it, as we men can sometimes do, at times in life when we fall in hard times and society isn't there for us, right? And there's no emotional support. Then Jim says death and his cock are the world. So it's like basically the world is made up of people who are living, as symbolized by life force or the phallic symbol or lingam, right? Or in this specific case, Jim Morrison's cock. And then death, since life and death are part of the same cycle. And a cycle of death and rebirth is represented by the god Shiva, who owns the phallus, that is the creative force of the universe that gives life. And then Shiva is also the god of death, who takes life, right? So he takes and gives in the cycle of death and rebirth. And then Jim says he can forgive his injuries in the name of wisdom, luxury, and romance. So it's like I said, we cover up the hell we are living in with arts and culture and sensual pleasures and try to give it meaning through mythos and morals and romanticizing things and to learn lessons from our life experiences and gain wisdom from it. And we romanticize existence and do all this stuff so it doesn't seem so bad. If you can do these things well enough, you can forgive your injuries. You can heal emotionally, which you will have many of in life. As a man, you're going to suffer many injuries. So it seems that self-healing and forgiveness may be the key to living well. And so we seek out things like sex, romance, love, and relationships and marriage with women in order to try to give beauty and enjoyment and meaning, and some sort of wholesomeness and goodness to life, right? In order to cover up all of the sort of the darkness and death and decay, and try to turn depression into happiness, or at least pleasure, right, or some sort of emotional fulfillment or sensual fulfillment, whatever you can get out of life, right? And that when you suffer injuries, it cause you pain. When you have your feelings hurt, you need to learn to forgive, because life is full of hurt, for men especially. And we can try to stay positive, right? And practice self-healing and positive psychology, right? And cover up the pain with pleasure, various types. But, there's only so much masking of our pain we can do. And sometimes you do need to feel pain, and suffering gives life greater meaning, right? And we need to allow ourselves to feel sad and do things like lament, which is what this poem is about, right? So the climax of this poem goes on to say, sentence upon sentence, words are the healing lament for the death of my cock's spirit has no meaning in the soft fire. Words got me the wound and will get me well, if you believe it. So the reason he writes his poetic lament is not to be sad about the death of his cock, but because in using his words to write and express his sadness, he is releasing it and healing himself, right? There's a sense of nihilism as he says that the death of his cock's spirit, or his sexual spirit, has no meaning in the soft fire, but this also means that there's no lost sentiment or value in losing one's sexuality or one's phallus as a man, or as Jim calls it, the cock, and thus becoming celibate. But is this just about sex? Because he then says, words got me the wound and will get me well if you believe it. So his wounds come not necessarily from sex, but perhaps by being told I love you by female, and then having her deceive him and break his heart or do something awful, as we know they can do. And Jim has made songs before to that to that tune, saying things like "woman is a devil." So I know that, while he was able to participate in great orgiastic pleasures and some very spiritual love affairs, that he has certainly been hurt by some very evil women. But luckily, as a poet, he has the power of words to heal his heart and get him well. So the same words that can hurt you can also heal you if you believe in them. And in fact, believing in words is, in a sense, the basis of spirituality. And even though the death of Jim's cock is at first meaningless, perhaps it can go on to mean something after its death, as tends to happen with messiahs and such. For Jim goes on to say, "All join now in lament for the death of my cock, a tongue of knowledge in the feathered night. Boys get crazy in the head and suffer. I sacrifice my cock on the altar of silence." And so, by swearing off sex and taking a vow of celibacy, because as you can see, sex has crucified his penis, he asks that we join with him in lament for the death of his cock, a sort of symbolic ritual vigil, so that we may learn from his life lessons of his sexual escapades. Because he has learned, as many of us men do, that boys get crazy in the head and suffer from their sex hormones when they go off and do crazy orgiastic things. And so Jim Morrison would like to make an example of himself and the virtues of celibacy by sacrificing his cock on the altar of silence. And I believe that silence to mean a silence about his sexual impulses towards women, a denial of his own libido and primal sexual urges, a stifling of his wish to express his sexual attraction to the women he sees and meets. Something that is very difficult for a former playboy gone monk mode, I know, because I've done it. Or it may actually mean that his sacrifice for men is fucking all these women so that other men do not have to, because he realizes that they're actually evil, that they use their sexuality to latch on to you like succubuses and to basically leech life force off of you like that, right? So, that he's sacrificed his cock to all of these women to save all of these men, kind of like how Jesus sacrificed himself for men's sins. And Jim would like this sacrifice on the altar of silence to be an example to all of us, that we may all take vows of silence and celibacy so that we may be protected from these evil she-devils who want only to crucify our cocks and drain us of our life force like the vampires that they are. And just aside, I think that this last line is an incredibly powerful one that always gives me chills. I sacrifice my cock on the altar of silence. Such a powerful line. Just one of multiple powerful lines in this poem. Another great line is a tongue of knowledge in the feathered night. I have no idea what that means exactly. I think he may just be using words poetically to create certain imagery and impressions in our mind. I don't know. But, whenever I'm listening to this poem or reading it, it conjures up the feelings of sexual exhaustion and emotional exhaustion, heartbreak, and other issues that women cause us men emotionally and sometimes sexually, just in pursuit of this romantic ideal of love and some sort of domestic bliss, or sexual or spiritual bliss, or whatever joy that love is supposed to bring you, to cover up the fact that we're all decaying and dying inside and living otherwise meaningless lives, oftentimes with suffering too. That we're basically living a lie as well, and that love is actually a lie that we're living in order to, again, to cover other things up. We have these lies to cover up other lies. Sexual pleasure is just to cover up for the fact that we are here to reproduce, and once we've done that, we basically are free to go ahead and die because we fulfilled our physical purpose on Earth already. So this poem is basically like a culmination of painful realizations where I think one morning after a night of passionate lovemaking, Jim wakes up and realizes his cock has been crucified by his lover. And everything sort of comes together for him as he stares down at it like an alcoholic having a moment of clarity. And finally the veil is lifted and he can see clearly. I have a feeling that is what this poem is about, because he mentions something like this happening in an epic poem he wrote called The Celebration of the Lizard, one of my other top 3 poems of all time. I highly recommend you look it up. And if you want me to read that or do more poetry readings from him, I can. But otherwise, I think this poem sums up the sexual revelations of us MGTOW monks and some of the feeling and inspiration I have behind the masculinism movement as well. So I figured it was a perfect poem to share with you. And like I said, it's my favorite poem of all time from my favorite poet of all time, someone who has been most influential to me as a poet. Back when I was in primary school, I really struggled a lot, especially when I started doing drugs and hanging out with the bad crowd. But there was one subject that I did really well in, and that was English. I had a way with words. You see, I could write this mind-blowing poetry and essays and short literature. However, unfortunately, that school would censor me, and I was always getting into trouble for the way I used words and actions. I was constantly getting suspended or even expelled altogether, maybe even with an arrest to go along with it. I remember one time when I was getting into trouble with the vice principal, who was a very hardcore Christian. He was pissed off about an essay I wrote that was anti-Christian and actually pro-Satanism. It was basically about how, objectively speaking, the God of the Bible was the villain in the story and Satan or the devil was the hero. Oh man, boy was he pissed. But the principal, who was a wiser man, took me aside and said to me, "You know what, kid? You are a very good writer. If you just wouldn't write about such controversial, taboo, and hated subjects so much and use so much shock value, you could have a great career in writing. But all this dark stuff is going to turn people off." And you know what? He was right. So now, as an uncensored adult, I use the full power of words and their ability to really mindfuck you people. So you better put on your brain condoms so you can get yourself a copy of my Mindfuck Poetry book. A trippy read for when you need to alter your mindset that will really fuck your mind and get you into a different headspace whenever you need an escape from reality. And for you spiritual people out there, I have a book of extra spiritual and psychedelic poetry called Spiritual Apocalypse, Surreality, which has been inspired by my practices with shamanism. A transcendent journey deep into a hot, wet, transdimensional wormhole that will not only mind fuck you, but spirit fuck you as well. So you better make sure to wear a full raincoat over your soul for this one. Take a break from the ordinary. Give yourself something actually interesting and exciting to read for a change. Get your copies on sale today by clicking the links below. Personally, now I'm going to be doing a reading of one of my poems next, also on the penis, more specifically on the phallic symbol. And I wrote this poem as a response to something called the vagina Monologues. I'm not sure if you've heard of this, but it was a sort of theatrical performance or set of monologues or speeches given by feminist performers on their vagina. And, you know, basically the symbolism of the vagina. The vagina is this yoni, a sacred archetype. It's got all this symbology and it can represent so many different things and so many different things can represent it. So they would do these monologues that were like, my vagina is a, and then describe it. So I wrote this poem as a masculinist response to the vagina monologues on the phallic archetype called my phallus. My phallus is a sword or staff, a dangerous weapon of war. And my phallus is a primordial spring, a thing of creation and life. My phallus is a powerful magic wand, an intense instrument of wondrous pleasure. And my phallus is a tree or mushroom, a biological tool of the earth. My phallus is a religious symbol, and my phallus represents me, God. So now let's break down this poem of mine, which is entirely made up of metaphor, as you can see, and I'll talk about the symbology of it. First, I start out by saying my phallus is a sword or staff, a dangerous weapon of war. So what I'm trying to say here is not so much like, hey, don't fuck with me because I'll whip out my cock, which is like a sword or staff, and hit you with it. Well, maybe that is what I'm saying, at least in part. But what I'm really saying here is that as a man, who is a man because he has a cock, I am dangerous. My cock is a source of testosterone, which makes me a dangerous barbarian. For that reason, you shouldn't be fucking with men or their cocks, because we will strike back. Maybe not with our big hard cocks, but with something like a sword or staff or these days a gun. But we're talking in symbology. I want there to be sort of a ancient, sort of spiritually traditional feel to the symbology that I'm using here. So in that light, then I go on to say, and my phallus is a primordial spring, a thing of creation and life. So what I'm trying to say here is that we as men have the creative power to give new life to a woman in our cocks, which makes our cocks like a fountain of youth or some magical primordial spring of life, or something fantastic like that, like you would hear about in fairy tales and mythology and religion. There's always some sort of phallic or primordial spring of life symbology in just about every culture. All right, and that is symbolized by the phallic symbol. And while women today may be just crazed baby killers, people should respect men's ability to give new life, because it is precious, and it comes from the phallus, which is a symbol of creation and life, and that creative energy or creative force, life force, whatever you want to call it, that comes from the cock spiritually. Again, you could be thinking of this metaphysically or metaphorically, one way or another. The phallus is a sacred archetype that gives life on earth. And then I go on to say, my phallus is a powerful magic wand, an intense instrument of wondrous pleasure. Because it is important to add that the phallus is also a symbol of the powerful pleasure that it can bestow upon you through sexual experience and orgasm. Something more blissful than any other experience you may ever have in life, which happens right at the moment in which you would be ejaculating and bringing new life into a woman, right? So it is a very spiritual thing. It's very spiritually symbolic, the pleasure of the orgasm. It is literally the most pleasure you will ever feel in life, and it can be very drug-like and an even spiritual experience. And this is part of why the philosophy of the phallus is such a spiritual one. It's as if the phallus is like a symbolic magic wand or some other magical instrument in, shamanism or sorcery. I believe that it is largely due to the experiences of orgasmic bliss that your penis causes when it has sex and wants to then make new life, that it became such a worshipped symbol in India. All right, so speaking of shamanism, I then move on to say my phallus is a tree or mushroom, a biological tool of the earth. Sometimes the orgasms you can have are so powerful, they are actually like psychedelic drugs, like mushrooms. And the penis has kind of a mushroom-like shape, and the mushroom is an important symbol in our mythos, like the phallic symbol. And like a mushroom or tree, our penises are just biological instruments of Mother Nature, that fucking whore. Their primary function is for breeding, and just like any other male animal, that is our biological imperative, and that is really all nature cares about. And that's the meaning of life when it comes to our physical bodies. But when it comes to our minds and spirits, there is so much more to life than just sex. And our penis is a religious symbol, symbolizing our masculinity, as well as the highest male god, Shiva, in the most ancient religion. And that symbol is called a phallus. So that is why I conclude the poem by saying my phallus is a religious symbol, and my phallus represents me, God. Because as Hinduism teaches, and the philosophy of the phallus and Shiva teaches, is through getting in touch with our sexual and spiritual nature of our phallus, and that energy that Shiva has bestowed us with, that gives us the power to create new life. We are actually also getting in touch with the godhead of Shiva, and through the experience of orgasm and that bliss that it causes, you're experiencing the bliss of the godhead Shiva. So this poem is basically about the different spiritual metaphors and symbology for the sacred masculine archetype of the phallus. It literally shows how meaningful and metaphysical the nature of the phallus is when we really think about it. And thus the same goes for masculinity as a whole, which it is just a symbol for. The poem is really saying that masculinity is spiritual and is a sacred archetype as represented by the phallic symbol. And if you do not know what the sacred masculine archetype is, be sure to check out the video playlist I made on it, linked below. And if you'd like to read some more of my poetry, I've left a link to the book of poetry that poem actually came from below, where I have all sorts of philosophical poetry and short literature on metaphysics and shamanism and mysticism and other magical, fantastic types of things. And if you'd like to discuss your thoughts and opinions on this poem or any of my poetry, or share some of your own favorite poetry, be sure to do so in the comments below. Otherwise, that concludes this talk. Thanks for listening. If you like this video, be sure to hit the like button and share these messages with everyone by sharing the video on social media and talking about these things as well. And lastly, be sure to check out the links in the description below for other resources for your masculine personal development, living the life you want to as an independent man, especially my book of metaphysical poetry and short literature called Spiritual Apocalypse, Surreality, a mystical testament of shamanic pathwork and the metaphysical concepts and philosophies that they revealed. The link is right there below, and you can stay tuned for the next video coming out soon. And make sure you subscribe so you'll be notified when that is. And until then, take care of yourselves, men, because no woman out there is going to.